I'll be speaking briefly today about some research I've been doing into embodied practices as they're deployed in ancient Mediterranean scribal practice. So the integration between the body and the work of the scribe. Real right?
Go.
Okay.
Let's see.
So I found the notion that scribal practice was de facto strenuous on the body of the scribe is a misconception. This idea has been popularized, especially in colorful lamentations by medieval scribes in their colophons in particular. In one such colophon, the 10th century scribe Florentius of Vallauranca bemoans, and can we switch to the next one? Since he who does not know how to write reckons it to be no work, I will tell you now, in detail, if you wish to know, how ponderous the burden of writing is. It blinds the eyes, it crooks the back, it breaks the ribs, it shoots pain into the loins, and it rears up all manner of suffering in the body. Florentius and his contemporaries surely had their reasons for lodging these now immortalized complaints. However, I would suggest we should not take their experiences as indicative for the lived realities of all professional writers, especially not those who inhabited the ancient Mediterranean world. Ancient Mediterranean scribes, unlike many of their medieval counterparts, were not aristocratic literary elite who viewed copying texts as acts of service or works of piety. As craftsmen, many scribes in the ancient Mediterranean were apprenticed from childhood, in addition to being trained since near infancy by their parents in adjacent scribal skills. Their crafts were their livelihoods, their bodies were their livelihoods. If the body of the scribe was too strained or damaged to function, the scribe's very existence was then threatened. So professional scribal practice in the ancient Mediterranean was optimized by scribes to take care of their own bodies and to use their bodies most comfortably and effectively. And I'm not arguing here at all that ancient Mediterranean scribes, and least of all enslaved literate workers, led completely comfortable, absolutely pain-free lives. In fact, we gather from some of the apprenticeship contracts that survived that scribes likely worked very long hours and would gladly rest after writing from sun up to sundown, the prescribed term of apprenticeship in many of our contracts. And of course, no amount of skill or innovation by the scribe might fully counteract inhumane working conditions and harsh treatment imposed by apprentice masters, by employers, and by slaveholders. But this does not mean that ancient scribes were wholly without agency. They retained control over how they plied their craft, how their tools were formed and manipulated, which techniques were deployed, and in what manner. So in this paper, I argue that ancient scribes used the limited agency they did have to develop ergonomic practices, methods of working that prioritized, protected, and preserved their own bodies. And I make this case by highlighting several examples of ancient scribal practice that were carefully optimized to integrate with and to harmonize with the scribe's body. So I'll begin with perhaps our clearest example of employing the body, developing or deploying the body in scribal practice, and that's what is called the use of anthropic measures for ruling manuscripts. An anthropic measure refers to the practical system of measurement of margins and intercolumns by human hand. This is used widely, for example, in Ethiopian Ge'ez scribal culture today. Appropriate space is apportioned on the margins of the manuscript by measuring these margins against the very fingers meant to interact with them, meant to hold them and to turn them. Sean Winslow, a scholar of Ethiopian manuscript culture, details the system of anthropic measures in current Ethiopian scribal practice. So the top margin, he writes, should be large enough so that when the book is held from underneath, like so, the fingers may wrap around the manuscript without touching the text block. The bottom margin measured with the thumb so that you can hold the manuscript from underneath. The side margins you can also measure with the thumb so that you can hold the manuscript like such, or with two fingers. The intercolumnar space, the space between columns of writing, may be measured with the width of the finger, or more generously, the width of the thumb as a guide. And I like to imagine this is so that you can trace your finger along the intercolumn while writing or while reading. And now, this system of ruling is actually consistent with data from William Johnson's book rolls and scribes in Oxyrhynchus, suggesting that anthropic measures have been used as guidelines since antiquity. For example, the anthropic measure used in the Ethiopian practice for intercolumns, so that's either the width of the index finger, about 1.5 centimeters, or the width of the thumb, about 2.0 centimeters. This neatly aligns with and gives maybe some practical explanation for Johnson's observation that intercolumns in ancient papyri were most commonly either 1.0 centimeters or 1.5 centimeters or 2.0 centimeters in width. The ultimate utility and practicality of such a system is that it ensures all margins are spacious enough that the manuscript's user is able to comfortably handle the book without touching the text block. Particularly important if you're writing with ink. We don't have that luxury with the inkless writing in these manuscripts. A scribe's body itself contained this knowledge, the knowledge of these dimensions, and then transferred it to the manuscript that the scribe produced, an anthropic template that rendered the objects they were creating accommodating to their own bodies and therefore to the human bodies of the manuscripts and users. Next, the writing practices of ancient scribal workers were also built on these principles of practicality, clever simplicity, and maximum comfort for the body. When a trained copyist writes with the reed pen and ink, it's not some tediously forced cramping action of the fingers that produces a quality hand. Rather, it is one, the cut of the pen, and two, the angle at which the pen is held to the writing surface. A scribe who mastered these aspects of the pen could copy an even lengthy manuscript beautifully, swiftly, precisely, and comfortably. So starting with the cut of the pen, as many of you very likely know, in the ancient Mediterranean world, reed pens cut with a split nib were the dominant tool for writing in ink on papyrus as well as on ostraca and wooden tablets and parchment. So common that throughout the Roman Empire that the Latin word for reed, calamus, came to mean pen. Reed pens were so prevalent in the Greco-Roman world because the material was plentiful, inexpensive, simple to work into a tool, and easy to recut. This final element is crucial. Cutting and recutting the pen was one of the most core and essential acts of scribing. The form of the reed pen is functional. The split in the nib helps to direct ink onto the page and to retain it. The angle at which the nib is cut corresponds to the angle at which the scribe intends to hold it relative to the page and the style of the hand they wish to produce. The length of the pen reflects how the tool is going to be held, the scribe's posture, how close to the manuscript they want to position themselves. All of these critical aspects of scribal practice are entangled in the precise cut of the pen, the precise form of this tool. And so it makes good sense that based on papyrus evidence, a scribe would need to resharpen their pen frequently, about every 50 lines of writing or so. These reed pens wear down relatively quickly, and the professional scribe would want to have control over their most important tool. Next, the hold of the pen. The ideal cut of the pen is predicated on the scribe's embodied understanding of how best to hold and handle this tool. The scribe's hold of the pen is a tacit, embodied practice determined by what the individual writer's body feels to be comfortable and convenient. An ancient Mediterranean copyist's reed pen is designed to be held loosely. It's not an implement for forcing ink onto a page, but it's a natural extension of the writer's body, their hand and their body's spatial awareness. The way a scribe holds the pen has a profound impact on their writing, which is especially noticeable in their script. So 20th century calligrapher, founder, father of modern calligraphy, Edward Johnston, demonstrates this in some of his diagrams in detail. So when using a reed pen, the angle of the pen relative to the writing surface directly affects the direction that thin or thick strokes are going to be formed when moving the pen across the page in a horizontal, vertical, or oblique direction. A square cut nib, you can see this here, so nib cut straight across, held at an angle to the page, roughly 30 to 45 degrees to the writing line, will produce very thick oblique strokes when written down from left to right, and very thin hairline strokes when writing down from right to left. An oblique nib, so a nib cut at an angle, held at this same angle, or a square cut nib when held directly straight to the page. This will produce thick strokes when writing straight down vertically and thin strokes when writing horizontally. Through proper angling, a well-trained scribe could thus produce a script with remarkable variability in stroke width and with sudden changes from thin to thick strokes or from thick to thin strokes. To sum up, the angle at which a scribe holds their pen influences the chosen cut of the nib. These two choices together determine the exact angle at which the tip of the nib touches the page. And that point of contact, the angle at which the flat of the nib strikes the manuscript, is what produces the stylized look and feel of a scribe's paleographic hand. That is, the scribe's masterful use of the tool creates the professional grade writing, not any sort of tensely maintained muscular movement in the writer's fingers. In fact, to facilitate the smooth and swift action of the pen over the writing surface, Johnston writes again that the pen should be held so lightly that the act of writing should draw the edge of the nib into perfect contact with the paper, with the result that the writer should be able to feel what the pen is doing. The artisan's tools were an extension of their own embodied spatial knowledge. The body's knowledge guided the tool as it navigated the tension of the nib against the writing surface, the texture of the writing support, the flow of the ink. Scribal writing was not merely the process of effectively applying ink to paper, though they're often compared to Xerox machines. That's not all that was happening. It was an act of extending one's body onto the page. To write properly with a reed pen, a copyist needed to adopt appropriate scribal posture. I think we'll be hearing more about this later in the conference. Effective writing posture was another tool in the scribe's kit, a technique that allowed them to create their own sloped writing surface and to write comfortably and at length without straining their neck, their shoulders, or their back. Like the anthropic measures I've discussed, these scribal practices make use of and synchronize with the scribe's body. The natural dimensions of the scribe's body become the basis and the guide for effective and ergonomic writing. Writing desks, as we likely know, were not used until later in antiquity. Typical scribal practice through the ancient Mediterranean was to balance a book roll on one's knees. And we have a couple of images, both from modern Ethiopian scribal practice and from an ancient relief of what this could potentially look like. A scribe taking notes on papyrus on the go might place the writing surface on an elevated knee, as we see here, placing their foot upon a raised platform, maybe even on their own capsa, in which they carry their book rolls. The scribe could then tuck their pens and tools beneath the non-dominant arm, keeping them in their theka, their leather scribal kit. This is an example. It's likely a highly stylized example for the purpose of artistic rendering, but at the very least, it gives us some idea of what someone's writing practice might have looked like. A scribe writing a more long-form text took up a seated posture on a bench, a chair, a stool, or on the ground. Scribes would extend their legs and cross one over the other, creating one, a space between their knees where the book roll could be pulled taut, and two, a natural slope of roughly 45 degrees. And this is, again, an example in modern Ethiopian scribing practice. We have several ancient examples of a scribe writing in a seated posture as well, wearing scribal skirt. This is what it might actually look like deployed by a craftsman rather than in a stylistic representation. A sloped writing surface, as the bend in the knees helps naturally develop. This is critical when writing with a reed pen and carbon ink. Not only is it more comfortable, preventing pain in the neck and the shoulders and the back that would be caused from craning over a page that's lying flat on a surface, it's also mechanically important for scribing. A sloped writing surface allows the scribe to view their work directly straight on rather than having to look down. And it also prevents ink from either pooling on the page or running down the page too rapidly, or running off of the pen too rapidly. So that the greater the writing surface is sloped, the lesser the angle at which you have to hold the pen. A writing surface that's straight down, you have to hold the pen 90 degrees to the page. And reed pens with split nibs, they do actually hold a little bit of ink in them. So a pen held just like this will cause pooling and ink spills. Maybe some of you have seen things like this on manuscripts, likely either the result of a miscut or a misheld pen. So you want a writing surface that's a little bit sloped so that you have complete control of the action of the pen. If you want the ink flow to speed up, you can hold the pen. If you want it to slow down, you can move it at a horizontal angle to the page. As the practice of sloping the writing was critical for proper scribing, a training scribe would learn various techniques to create and maintain this slope. So I've already noted the scribal posture, which might develop this kind of slope. I also want to draw attention to one more little detail in this relief. I've noted how a scribe might step up on a platform to use their knee as a surface, but there's one more little thing in here that I think it's interesting to note. Lost the page. So you'll see the angle of the ankle is slightly raised on this scribe, so that the scribe is standing upon the toe of their right foot. If I could just use this chair really quickly. This slight extension of the ankle actually produces a pretty dramatic slope in the leg and the knee, which would prevent the scribe from having to bend straight down, writing at that undesirable 90-degree angle. And it's not necessarily the ideal sort of writing situation. This seated scribal posture is probably the gold standard if you want to write long form. But a scribe writing while standing, if they need to, could use this technique. I would suggest to produce a sloped writing surface, even if they don't have the ability to sit down. This is another example of how, for ancient scribes, writing posture was an innovation of both functionality and comfort. Finally, the physical context of writing, the space and the time in which writing and book work were and could be performed was also determined by the scribe's body. Maybe the foremost and most frequent grievance that we get from medieval scribes like Florentius of Valoranca, who I mentioned at the beginning, is the harm that scribing does to one's eyes. In the embodied knowledge of ancient Mediterranean scribes, we discover another simple and practical solution to this painful dilemma. So before the dawn of the writing desk, heavy, bulky writing furniture would have been more of a hindrance to the scribe than an aid, because these kinds of accessories impede a scribe's access to one of their most important resources, and that is natural light. Unencumbered by a writing desk, using their seated scribal posture to supply a sloped writing surface, scribes were free to seek out a location with ideal light for their writing. Natural light is always best, and in fact, many practicing scribes and calligraphers claim it is essential for quality writing. Johnston, the 20th century calligrapher, writes again that careful work should be done by daylight. A scribe, turned around. Work done by artificial light always appears faulty and unsatisfactory when viewed by day. And this is consistent with the practices of Ethiopian scribes today. Sergio Selassie, a scholar of Ethiopian manuscripts, observed that Ethiopian scribes strictly avoid writing by anything other than daylight, noting that the scribe has no fixed place to sit and write. He either sits in the courtyard of his own house, or if the weather is good, under the shade of a tree. The reason he prefers to sit outside in the open air while he writes is to protect his eyesight. The scribe has to protect his eyesight by writing only in the daytime when there is still daylight, still sunshine, and in the open air. Writing in a dim place is believed to cause eye trouble. For this reason, a scribe never writes during the evening hours using lamplight. Winslow notes the same among scribes he observed in Ethiopia, adding that scribes only work in while scribes only work in daylight, they prefer to work under some sort of shade, else the brightness of the page would be very hard on the eyes and it would be hot as well. Most scribes, Winslow notes, preferred to write seated in or near a doorway of their own house or workshop, and we saw an example of this back here, a scribe writing in the doorway, so inside, in the shade, but still under natural light in their own workshop. Working by the indirect light of day that comes through the door. A few other scribes chose to write outside in a market or a courtyard under the shade of a tree or of a building, and several had set up a sort of tented working enclosure for scribing. All scribes who were met with and whose practices were observed avoided artificial light, whether it was lamplight or electric light, citing the physical risks of scribing under dim or improper lighting. Given this consensus, the shift in late antiquity to writing desks situated in indoor settings, illuminated by artificial lamplight, may partially account for the medieval characterization of scribing as something that is strenuous on the body and especially strenuous on the eyes. Now, one thing we have to address here, Hella Eckert, in her impressive survey of writing tools, remarks that a significant number of ceramic oil lamps have been found in graves containing writing sets. She lists 19 examples of such tools and concludes logically that these lamps were used for writing in the evening. William Johnson demonstrates, however, that these lamps have a critical place in the writing set as a writing tool. They are necessary when writing with wax and a wax tablet, because the iron wax spatula only effectively adds or erases or reshapes the wax when it is slightly heated, as if over a flame. The oil lamp iurge, while sometimes used as a reading or writing aid, was never intended by ancient scribes to be widely and consistently and purposefully used for this tool. Scribes who were accustomed to writing in fully or partially open air settings under natural light don't need or desire this kind of aid, quote unquote. So to conclude, the desk lamp, unwieldy writing desks, and slow, tedious lettering are artifacts of a much later scribal tradition, one that might be dark and cramped and indoors and desk-based, a scriptorium model, if such a thing materialized. This, like the many laments of Florentius of Valoranca and his contemporaries, would seem wholly unfamiliar to an ancient Mediterranean scribe. As I hope to have demonstrated, ancient Mediterranean scribes built their crafts, their production of manuscripts, and the design and use of their implements and techniques around their most important tool, their bodies. Scribes were not mindless hands set to writing texts or copying books. They were people, individuals with lives and with bodies that were central to their lives and to their experiences. The scribe's body contained a template for aesthetic and functional ruling. It extended itself onto the page through deftly held tools to guide swift yet subtle writing. It unfolded into a desk, a chair, and a bookstand to allow for writing in versatile conditions. It dictated the places in which writing might happen and the times it could take place. I urge that scribes should be recentered in this conversation about their own work and their own bodies, and that the history of the book ought to be reimagined not as a discipline merely owed to the writer's laboring hand, but as a legacy engineered by and for the body of the scribe. Thank you.